Happy New Year. And I'm excited to see all of you and hear from all of you today. As you know, if you got our email this morning, our book, the hardcover book, here it is in living color with our beautiful purple pages and beautiful layout, is now available for you on Amazon.com. So this is the hardcover that many of you have been waiting for. A lot of you did order the paperback for Christmas holidays. Here's the back, ooh and ah. And we really appreciate your support, but just note that there are over approximately 8,000 to 10,000 daily meditation readers now, and we only printed 1,500 of these books because they are a special edition. They really turned out beautifully in the spirit of what hardcover books used to look like at one point. So Tom and I are very excited and very proud of these books, and we hope that you will have them in your possession for a long, long time to come. And also think of them as special gifts for Valentine's Day coming up, certainly weddings, for your lovers, your dear friends, also for your children. I have an 18-year-old male nephew who I'm going to save a copy for because he certainly could understand the concepts today. He's very bright and pretty sophisticated, but I don't think they'll have the meaning and weight to him at 18 as they will at 28. So I plan on saving a copy for him as he moves into adulthood. So today we're going to talk about sexuality, which I think is the perfect topic to kick off the new year, especially because this book is about sex and sexuality, and so what a better thing to talk about then, but what sexuality actually means to us and how we want to define it going forward for ourselves. This is something I've been talking about and thinking about a lot lately, which is the spectrum of sexuality from that which can be incredibly painful and problematic to people to that which is beautiful and celebratory and alive, and everything in between. And so I think and I hope that even the field of sex and sexuality, which is often at odds about whether sex can be an addiction or not, people think that sex addiction therapists think that alternative lifestyle sexuality like BDSM and kink and fetishes are automatically addictive, which is not true. It's a mythology. That all of these disparate factions can come together and recognize that sex really just exists on a continuum, and everyone has good and bad experiences of it, but we each have to define what works best for us as we move into adulthood. So let's look at this topic of sexuality. Lao Tzu in the 6th century BC said, "A person's approach to sexuality is a sign of his level of evolution. Unevolved persons practice ordinary sexual intercourse. Placing emphasis upon the sexual organs, they neglect the body's other organs and systems. Whatever physical energy is accumulated is summarily discharged, and the subtle energies are similarly dissipated and disordered. It's a great backward leap." So what is he talking about here when he says placing emphasis upon the sexual organs means that we neglect other organs and systems? I think what he's saying is that we miss the organ of the body, for example, and the systems of neurohormones, which I don't know if they were thinking about or talking about in the 6th century BC, but clearly they were aware of bodily-based hormonal functions and fluctuations that shifted and changed, namely those feelings of love and excitement and high arousal. And that when physical energy is accumulated and just discharged sort of willy-nilly, then the subtle energies are also lost and discharged. So in other words, just getting off for the sake of getting off may be somewhat unevolved if that's the only way that you do it. Because people can be myopic, whatever end of the spectrum they're on. So an example of that would be that oftentimes people in New York think that Manhattan is the beginning and end of the world. And I was just with friends and family in the city over Christmas, and we were laughing about that people that are born and raised in Manhattan think that the New York Times is the gospel truth and everything that happens right there. And in some ways it's true because so much is happening there, but in other ways it's a myopia. It can be a form of ghettoization as much as the person who's super conservative living in a tiny town thinks that their way's the only way. So part of the message in this quotation is that there has to be an elasticity, an opening around sex and sexuality that has us examining more than just our one limited way of doing something. Because if our approach to sexuality is our sign of our personal evolution, then we want to look closely at how long we've done it the same way. It would be sort of like wearing the same pair of, pants decade after decade after decade in your life. You might start to feel like you're kind of out of fashion or not in step with things that are changing, and that may mean you're a little bit closed-minded about the possibility of changing your pants. So when we talk today, think about some of the old habits you have around sex and sexuality, or even old ideas that you might have, and what are some things that you want to explore or try on or try out this year. And just because you try something on doesn't mean that you're going to buy it. It just means that you're trying it on and checking it out. So I want to remind everyone that if you have questions, you can type them into the chat box, and I will pick them up and read them out loud and answer them the best I can. Also, certainly if you have comments that are additive that you want me to comment on as well. Sexuality is a core component of personal identity. I think it's really in some ways at the core of who we are, and it's a determining factor in sexual behavior. So how did you come to have your sexual identity? Who formed it? Who forged it? How did you figure it out? For some of us, it came in the form of just sort of happening upon it. It was just a natural developmental stage that started out with playing doctor when you were 5 years old or 6 years old with the neighborhood kid. Or I'll show you mine if you show me yours. And if that wasn't shamed and it was stewarded in sort of a natural developmental way, then you started out with a sexuality that was not shamed in any way. If later in adolescence you started to find out about your sexuality because you ejaculated by accident, or you saw a magazine by accident, or you were online looking at pornography, then your sexuality would have started to be formed in that way. And Dr. John Money, who was at Johns Hopkins University in the 1980s, talked about love maps, and that these love maps created these sexual arousal templates, what Patrick Carnes later termed erotic template, and that these love maps get set very, very early on in life based on what we're exposed to, based on what feels good, based on the messages that we get from sex. So that little seed starts to germinate very early on, and if it goes unexamined, we can find out later in life that we're engaging in some behaviors that we really don't like but are highly arousing to us, or we don't understand what we do, or we feel like we're limited, or we're scared, or any number of other things because we haven't taken the time to examine our sexuality. And sexual behavior can often be mistaken for sexuality, that we think that just because that's what we do, that is the full repertoire of what our sexuality is. Just like external actions of our lives, careers, relationships, social activities, can be mistaken for our inward experiences. So how many times have you met someone who was in a particular career and you envied that career and you thought, wow, that person's career looks great, or their relationship looks amazing. I wish I had that. Never knowing what their internal experience was like, never knowing what it took for them to get that career, the amount of blood, sweat, and tears they had to put into making that happen. Or their relationships might look perfect on the outside, but you don't know internally the amount of strife or pain or even sometimes domestic abuse that's taking place. So we can't look at someone's outsides or even our own externals and assume that they're lining up with the internal experience. So does anybody have any thoughts or questions about that? About what comprises your sexual core, or how we might do one thing but feel differently inside? I know when I was going through my own sexual experimentation as a young person, I was doing a lot of things that actually looked like fun, that were fun. But when I kept doing them over time, I started to not feel so good about myself internally. And that's when the external and the internal started to not line up so well. Someone's saying, oh, I'm so glad to hear this. I thought I was the only one that had that experience. And we often think that, especially because of the confusing messages we get in our culture, that sex is supposed to look good and hot and erotic and fantastic at all times, even though some of those things don't line up with who we are. And I want to flip this on its head a little bit and talk about not just normative, monogamous, heterosexual sexuality. Let's look at people who say, you know what, that lifestyle is not really for me. A lifestyle for me is one of an open marriage or a polyamorous relationship. And that is who I think I am. And it's not because I've just been in a swinger scene for so long and I've sort of dulled myself out and I'm myopic and I'm in a ghetto just like the person who's only ever been in a monogamous committed relationship and is prudish about trying anything else other than missionary position. And my thinking, both of those people are myopic. Let's say the person has chosen their alternative sexual lifestyle, let's say an open marriage, because they have intended it. They've tried all these variations. They tried monogamy. They were always getting cheated on, or they cheated. They tried a full-on swinging experience, and they felt dead inside because it was sexual transactions, and they never felt like they had companionship or real love for somebody. So they had to reorganize that whole morass to come to an intentional way of being sexual in life. So I want to be clear that I'm not pointing to this normative heterosexist monogamous relationship as being the be-all, end-all. I don't know if it is for you. I know for today it is for me. That's the lifestyle that I choose, but I'm not propagating this or putting it off on you or anybody else. What I'm interested in people being intentional in their sexuality and being happy in it and celebrating it, whatever the configuration is. So someone writes and saying, there's a book called The Erotic Mind that talks of how that arousal template can change during life. And that is a beautiful book. Morin is the author of that book, I believe. And that book is a must-read for people that are interested in their sex and sexuality, because our arousal template can change during our lifestyle and lifetime, and should change. If we are examining our sexuality the way we examine our psyche and we examine our wardrobe to say, oh, those clothes are a little dated, then we want to examine our sexuality and say, oh, those ideas might be a little bit dated. I want to change them up a little bit. And oftentimes, people who are sexually addicted or compulsive are acting out of early childhood trauma, and it's a repetition and a compulsion of something that's not necessarily a choice. So when those traumas are healed, then even in the 12-step program, they talk about the return of choice, and reading The Erotic Mind would be a very great, I think, beacon for someone who's examining these things. Paul writes, asking, what does it take to revise a love map that was misshapen by sexual childhood abuse? And I would say definitely your own psychotherapeutic work, a deep examination of what the childhood sexual abuse was like, the effect it had on you, because many children who are sexually abused have a confused love map because the body, the physical body, the human organism is aroused by sexual touch. And that can be incredibly confusing when the behavior feels shaming or abusive or frightening. If you have a small child who's being abused by an adult, that can be very scary and very shaming and confusing because the body likes it, or the child likes that they're feeling special. And so they go on to choose experiences in life that are degrading, humiliating, furtive, secretive, that ultimately become destructive because of that erotic template. So cracking that open, feeling the painful feelings that couldn't be felt at that time, sometimes anger, rage, hatred for the offender, can be incredibly liberating, and it also creates integration in the system, in the mind and brain and body. And once that integration is had, what you might find are certain aspects of the abuse are still arousing to the physical body, but psychologically, the psychological abuse and the humiliation and shame aren't still tied into it. So each person has to make their own exploration of what that means for them and how they change those templates. Patsy asks, I think the external reflects what we are on the inside, so working on the inside works to change it on the outside. And I would say that's sort of a nice circular way of thinking things, that we usually, if we're congruent, who we are on the outside is reflective of who we are on the inside. Now, that said, if we are, householders and parents, and we're in professional careers or go to, a job that we feel is dignified for us, and we are comporting ourselves in a certain way, people might think that we're sexually shut down or prudish or maybe asexual, but that doesn't really line up with who we are sexually and in the bedroom. So in that way, our external doesn't always reflect who we are on the inside. Some people can be incredibly exhibitionistic on the outside and be sort of out there sexually all the time, but when it really comes right down to it, they're not capable of having deep love relationships, even though they might advertise that they are. So we want to be congruent internally and externally, and often we don't know the depths of who we are at all times. Most of us don't. And we don't always look on the outside the way we might be feeling inside. Someone says, please mention the name of the book again. I think the only book thus far that's been mentioned is The Erotic Mind. In addition to the book Mirror of Intimacy, our book on daily reflections that we're talking about today, which is now available in hardcover on Amazon. So here, this speaks to what somebody was asking about child sexual abuse and wounded sexuality, that sexuality is our true sexual nature, and sexual behavior is what we do sexually. And those two things can be at odds. We can know inside that we are deeply good people, and that we want to be healthy sexually, but we don't know what that means. But what we're doing sexually, we know is destructive or hurtful to ourselves and to other people. And so that is a wounded sexuality. It's a sexuality that is restless and not at ease. And this can have people engaging in copious sexual activity while really repressing their core sexuality. And these are people that are typically what I would call sexually addicted or compulsive, that they can use sex as a weapon against themselves, even though they will tell you that the sexual acts they engage in make them feel powerful, make them feel like, quote, a badass, make them feel sexually liberated and incredibly in control and powerful. And I would argue that a lot of that is coming from the dopamine high that they're getting internally. That novelty creates dopamine like nothing else in the human brain. And so that chronic novelty seeking, that hunting, that being on the hunt, that being made to feel exalted by the sexual anonymous partners around a person can make them continue to repeat the behavior over and over again, yet at the end of the day and the week and the months and the years, they find themselves alone and lonely and without companionship. And when one's sexuality has been wounded, the tendency is to grasp for help anywhere, often through partners that are struggling with a similar wound. So people tend to find each other. We tend to find people that are at our same levels of differentiation and at our same levels where the ability to attach and connect are concerned. So if we're engaging in behaviors that are a form of self-mutilation to ourselves, are hurting ourselves, we're likely not going to pick people who are very healthy, because healthy people will see the wounded person and they will go in the opposite direction. They won't typically pull them up out of the mire. And a question you might want to ask yourself is, if your sexuality were a country, would it be a developed nation or a desert island? So think about that right now, and if you would like to share some descriptive words that you associate with your sexuality, it might be interesting to see what comes up for people. So someone says, my sexuality is a desert island with an oasis off in the distance, which is lovely. If you can see that oasis, that means you can feel the moisture in the air, you can smell the water, and you can see a possibility of something delicious or exciting on the horizon. Someone says there are many different gardens on my island, which I love. So being single can make us feel sometimes like we're on an island, and maybe it isn't a desert island. It's an island that we've cultivated with gardens, with an oasis, so it's not a bleak desert island. If it's a desert island that is bleak, then I would encourage you to seek professional help and to start to look at ways that you can supplant that and make your island a little bit more desirable for you, and maybe to invite some tourists onto it. Anybody else? And by the way, a developed nation might not necessarily be such a great thing either. That could mean that you're having sex with anybody and everybody that you meet who comes to the door, that you hook up with online, that you're not discerning at all about your sex and sexuality, which can lead to all kinds of problems. Those are problems that happen in overly developed nations where people, there's not enough to eat, there's not enough place to sleep or live, people are getting sick and spreading disease all the time. So being overpopulated with your sexuality can sometimes be as problematic as being on a desert island where you are sexually averse or anorexic. Why is there this idea that if someone is solo that you are, quote, damaged or not normal? I think that that is a holdover, just like we have a lot of holdover ideas that are really reductionistic and sort of whittled down to kind of the lowest common denominator. Many people choose to be single. I didn't get married until I was 41 as a matter of choice. And now people can, make all sorts of judgments about that and projections and assumptions about it, but some of it was a deliberate choice. Some of it was I was still cleaning up the unmanageability of my past, and I didn't really know who I was. I felt like I really actually knew who I was at that point when I decided that marriage was the right thing for me. But being single was also incredibly lovely and fun. It was an opportunity for me to travel, to have experiences with a lot of different people, both emotionally, sexually, physically, to decorate my space the way I wanted it decorated, and to be in love with myself so that when I met somebody, it was an additive experience. It wasn't just out of this act of desperation. It would have been in the past for me that I just needed somebody to save me or somebody to make me feel whole. So I think if you are choosing to be single at this time, or maybe you're not even actively choosing it, but you just are, it's important to hold on to your dignity as a single person and celebrate it, because it will pass. It will pass in time. And everybody at some point in a relationship or marriage thinks, what was I thinking? I should be single, or it was more fun being single. So I think the point here is to stay present and in gratitude for what you do have. Someone says, I'm separated from a sex addict with no contact this time. It was a 32-year marriage. Much pain as a result of finding out about this issue in March of this year. I'm in therapy with a sex addiction therapist for recovery as a partner and also attended your intensive partner treatment program last summer. I now want to learn about healthy sexuality and would like to find a sex therapist here in Seattle where I live. Where would I look? How would I find a good treatment provider? Well, I know that John and Julie Gottman are in Seattle, and they are sort of the preeminent both couples therapists in the country, if not the world, and they would have great referral sources for you. Also, those of you that are interested in finding a sex therapist, you can go to the ASECT website, which is AASECT.org, and I'll type that in here. And ASECT, oops, I misspelled it. Okay, so go with the second URL. It stands for the American Society for Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. So people that are sexuality coaches, sex educators in universities, counselors, or certified sex therapists are on this network, and they are very well versed in notions around sex and sexuality. As a word of caution, not all of my fellow sex therapists believe in the notion of sex addiction, and so as a partner, I want you to be very careful about somebody denying your experience. 32 years is an incredibly long time. It's a lifetime to live with someone who's in active sexual addiction, and to live with that kind of betrayal and lie and hurt is extraordinarily traumatizing, and many sex therapists don't understand that concept. So I suggest that you interview a lot of people. If there are good sex therapists in your community, meet with all of them, make appointments with them, because therapists are human beings, period, who have some education and some life experience in psychotherapy. But at the end of the day, all of the outcome studies show that the most important element in psychotherapy is the relationship with the therapist. So if you walk in and that person is agitating to you, you don't like them, they remind you of your ex, whatever, then leave. And if you walk in and you have a sense of relief in your body, or that you can trust this person, or it feels like they feel solid and containing to you, then that's a good way to choose somebody. And if, as you go along, things are said that don't feel right or don't line up with your values or feel off, then you should bring those to the fore and talk about them in therapy. Therapy isn't just about bringing your problems to therapy. It's about talking about your relationship with your therapist, because it's an intimate relationship. So good luck to you in finding somebody, and I think that's a good place to start. And where sex education is concerned, we know that our culture doesn't provide a standard process to develop conscious sexuality, if at all. Our sex education now predominantly comes from pornography. And there was a time, and I think I said this on the last webinar, but there was a time when you had to be adult to look at online pornography because you had to have a credit card. And today, with all the various tube channels, anybody can look at pornography online, whether you're 5 or 15 or 105. It's a free-for-all. And when it is talked about, it's usually hastily talked about, and it's talked about in terms of what I call plumbing, how the penis works, how the vagina works. There's no mention of any kind of varied sexual expression or gender orientation or ways to measure what's functional and sexually fulfilling whatsoever. Forget it if you are, transsexual or bisexual or on the spectrum of sexuality in any way. What little information is out there remains heteronormative information. In a nationwide survey, 3 out of 4 teenagers cited friends and television as their main sources from popular media about getting cues about sexuality. About sex education, and if they were getting cues about sexuality from popular media in the locker room. So again, we don't have very many conscious way of imbibing knowledge about sexuality. And if you have the opportunity, if you're around young people in any capacity, whether you're a parent or an educator or somebody who works as young people in your office place, as you are cultivating your sexual expression and your sexual intentions about who you are, talk about it. Talk about it in your workplace. Talk about these meditations and say, hey, this might be helpful for you to start to think about your sexuality. Talk about Dr. Morin's book. Talk about any book you've read about sex and sexuality so that we can start to point our young people and all of us in the direction of an intentional, conscious sexuality rather than these closed down ideas that it's just one way. So take a moment here to ask yourself what you know about your sexual self and how did you gain that awareness. As you consider this, note signs of discomfort, confusion, or blankness. So what do you know about your sexual self today, and how did you come to gain this awareness? So I might say what I know about my sexual self is that it's evolving and that it's at a different place today than it's ever been. And I've gained this awareness because I've made it a study, really a lifelong study of what does it mean to be healthy sexually. That's the question I set out with. It's a question that is a quest. There's no answer to that question. It's an open-ended quest. And that's what I've come to know about it. And sometimes it's confounding. Sometimes it's maddening. Sometimes it's exciting. And sometimes it makes me feel sad. So any thoughts about this, what you know about your sexual self? And remember, this is anonymous. Nobody's seeing what you write to me except for me. And all I see are your first names. So there are 45 people on this call today, and I think one of you knows something about your sexual self. I just have a feeling about that. Okay, somebody says books, My Secret Garden and other similar type books. I found a book at a used bookstore called Asking About Sex and Growing Up by Joanna Cole. I got it for a friend's daughter, but I kept it for myself. That's lovely. I remember reading Nancy Friday's book at one point also, that books can see, books can open us to a world of sex and sexuality. In some ways, when we're young, educating us and teaching us things we never had any ideas about, and in other ways, reinforcing what we already knew, making us feel less abnormal and more a member of the human race. They can also point us in the direction of things that we've never tried before. And they can also take things that we've seen that appear grossly pornographic, if we see them in porn, and turn them into something that's more spiritual and celebratory. And what I mean by that is by looking at the tantric practices, not just the contemporary practices, but going back to the spiritual practices of Tantra, starts to give us a deeper context for how the contemporary practices arose, and also can take some things we might see in pornography that look so maybe disturbing and put them into a context that's more holistic so that those positions or those ideas are much less disturbing. My colleague Richard Blankenship writes that everybody's full names come up when they type things in. So, Richard, thank you for that. So I take back that it's anonymous. Everybody's seeing what I'm seeing in the text box. So if you want to maintain your anonymity about certain sexual things, be mindful about that. Thank you, Richard. Tony says, I'm constantly surprised by my sexuality. It tends to define simple labels. I see labels as being limited and constrictive at times, and I would say, hooray for you, Tony. It's true. Even these notions of bisexuality, it's like, what does that mean? We're sexual creatures. Pleasure is pleasure. If it feels good and it lines up with who you are and it doesn't make you feel shameful or bad about yourself, then enjoy yourself. let's see, looks like Tom or somebody from CHS is saying people can type in their real name, their full name, or an anonymous name when they sign in, and this was noted in the invitation. So note that for future webinars also, that if you want to type in a username for the webinar, then that's the name that will show up when we're in these text conversations. Someone says, my father gave my sister and me 2 volumes of Havelock Ellis's Psychology of Sex, but there was no talk. So I wonder how old you were when your father gave you those books, and that sort of dense and heavy reading for adolescents, especially at that time. So that is another form of sort of weird colonization, where a parent, and I'm sure your father was well-meaning, is saying, I'm going to give these books to you. It would be like me giving my book to my nephew or giving it to a 14-year-old and say, here's a great book on healthy sexuality. For kids, all they think is, ooh, that's so weird, or you're weird, or that's gross. But when there's no conversation about sex and sexuality, then there's no way for a kid to start to make meaning of all of these natural impulses that are starting to come online in the body. And no matter how we repress them, they are going to come out. They're developmental. They're built into the organism. It's how human beings are encoded and wired. So you must talk about sex and sexuality to your children and the young people around you, because they're going to find out anyway. Then someone says, you can also click on the drop-down arrow that says send to presenter only if you want to maintain your anonymity. So I'm learning about this the way that you are. Okay, someone says, I love expansive, holistic energy, taking care of my body, what I eat, and gathering information. The Language of Desire online course by Felicity Keith has been an amazing source of information with great new ideas. When I get back into relationship sexuality again, I can't wait to try some of them out. So that's a really great resource to know about also. So sharing resources on a forum like this is a way to expand sexuality too, because all of you are here because you are conscious about your sexuality. You want to intend your sexuality. You're interested in healing it or evolving it in some way. So being in like-minded communities where you can have these conversations in ways that feel safe and supportive is a way to expand sex and sexuality also. Someone writes, my mom got a book called something like Getting Through Junior High School, which was already a euphemism, but then she also wrapped the book in a dust cover made from a grocery bag so that even that little was not visible on the bookshelf. So that speaks to, there's something sweet about that, your mother's deep desire for you to know maybe more than she knew, but she had to wrap it up because of the shame that she had wrapped around her own sexuality and that our culture had wrapped around her. So it's not that our parents were bad people. They were living in a culture that said no. And one of the things that pornography is doing for us, even though it's creating a lot of problems for a lot of folks, it's also expanding our minds where sex and sexuality is concerned. It is forcing us as a culture to look at our sex and sexuality, and I think it's requiring that we be responsible and discerning about how we use it. So just like when prohibition was lifted from alcohol, everybody didn't go out and become alcoholic, but it certainly allowed people the opportunity to experiment with alcohol. And those people who had alcoholic genes became alcoholic, and those who didn't. And some of us were able to drink it and use it socially, some of us cannot. And the same is true with internet pornography and sexuality. Those people who are built as addicts because of their regulatory capacities and the way their brains and bodies are set up genetically and epigenetically are going to get lost in an addictive tendency. And those who don't have that problem aren't going to have that problem necessarily. Someone says, I'm a recovering sex addict and know that what unhealthy sex is, but what is healthy sex? How do I learn? Well, beginning these conversations is a way that you start. Reading, educating yourself, looking at these daily meditations and challenging yourself with the daily sex acts, and having conversations with people that you start to date, and not doing things the way you've always done them, doing things in ways that make you uncomfortable. For recovering sex addicts, addicts, I do tend to privilege the notion of intimacy. That sex addicts know how to make a crotch connection, but it's very difficult for them to make a heart connection. So making a heart connection will lead you to arousal over time if you don't know how to do that. So you have to risk getting uncomfortable in order to grow when you're in recovery from sex addiction. Many of us learn about sexuality in causal or frantic states. I certainly know that I did, that I was frantic to get out of my household. I was frantic to grow up and find out who I was sexually, and there was nobody championing that in appropriate ways. So I started jumping out of my bedroom window when I was 16, and that did not serve me well. It got me into a lot of painful situations and into trouble, which I eventually emerged out of, but I wouldn't recommend that for your average 16-year-old. Even if we collect the basic information regarding what goes where and why, we have to still experience the same underlying panic and repressive response. So back to John's question about being a recovering sex addict, and how to get into a healthy sexuality, that we have to experience the same underlying discomfort that goes with experimenting with sex. And I write about this in Erotic Intelligence, where sex initially can feel sort of wholesome or awkward or uncomfortable when you're starting to be sexual again from a more sane place and from an addictive place. So you've got to be able to tolerate that and recognize it as a sacred aspect of who you are that deserves at least the same level of care and commitment as a primary relationship would. So as a single person, treat your sexuality in a sacred way. Don't treat it like a public toilet. Don't treat it like a garbage can. Treat it like something that has meaning to you, and engage with someone who is meaningful to you, meaning you at least like the person or you register them as being safe and caring. And share affirmative words you'd like to associate with your sexuality. Speak them out loud to yourself in affirmations every day. Someone says, back to your earlier comment about what could be a healthier, you show me yours, I'll show you mine. There's a complication when it's gender specific. In my neighborhood, it was the boys devising a game of catch, whereby the girls had to show theirs if they got caught, but it was not reciprocal. This was surely a factor in socializing gender notions about girls' bodies being objects in a not-so-healthy way, even if the game itself were potentially healthy. If it had been mutual between genders, then it would have been more healthy, presumably. Add to that the aspect of getting caught and then punished by all the parents. Yes, there was a double whammy of shame, one gender-specific coming from male peers, another coming from parents about sex in general. So that is one of those awful, unfortunate things that happens. It's going to happen with children, but when the parents pile on, when the parents don't talk about it, that's when it really becomes problematic, and it gets embedded in the autonomic nervous system, in the body. It's not just a psychological hit. It's a hit to the body, and that's where it can become really problematic over time. So, yes, things have changed. When I was a child, it was a one-to-one transaction. I'll show you mine if you show me yours, boy to girl. This definitely became a power differential between males and females, and then the parents, out of their own shame and anxiety, shame the children on top of it. And you can see how that's going to do nothing but create a mess over time. Someone says, my mom gave me and my siblings sex education talks when we were very young, but only when we were driving in the car, and I've heard this before. It was very confusing, and it didn't feel comfortable to ask questions, so I kind of I faked that I understood. Now, this is a parent who's like moving up the food chain, and parents do it in the car because they think it's less anxiety-provoking for the kids, but really it's for them. The problem is twofold for that. One is there's no eyeball-to-eyeball contact, which creates intimacy by definition, and the parent can track the child's discomfort and say, you know, it looks like this is making you uncomfortable, or I notice you're blushing, honey, what's so funny, let's talk about that, or yeah, that is kind of icky, or I get that that's sort of freaky and it's weird, but that's what people do with each other, so that it's a normal conversation and the parent is tracking the child's dysregulation in the body. The other problem within the car is that the peripheral vision is activated, and that is the threat response system. Eyeball to eyeball is not threat response. Peripheral vision is always on call for threat detection. And that's why couples should not have conversations about anything of meaning driving in the car, because that's when we all get into arguments. Someone from Chicago says, great talk, thank you. And Patsy says, I was curious about your comment about sometimes feeling sad with your sexual experience sometimes. I have felt that way once in a while ago. Could you expand on that just a bit? I think sadness can come with, for me, there's grief and loss about my changing sexuality as I age, and as I age as a woman. That makes me sad sometimes. Sadness after sex can be a sense of melancholy, a sense of aging and changing and life moving so quickly. It seems to bring life into very sharp relief, because you have to remember on the front end of sex, we've got dopamine and adrenaline and all of these chemicals that are pushing us towards excitement, novelty, and eventual ejaculation for men, orgasm for women, and then the refractory period, all of those neurochemicals wash out, and we're left with oxytocin, which is the chemical of trust and bonding. And so that's going to make us feel a little bit more introspective, a little bit more looking at the big picture of life. And if you're prone towards that anyway, which I am, that can make the experience a little bit bittersweet. For some, it can be downright melancholy or depressive, depending on their levels of serotonin and who they are. So you just have to be mindful about that. Someone says, I have a family friend whose young child might be transgender. The parents are accepting, but that's it. It does seem with children's sexuality, especially LGBT, that it's a good idea to let them develop on their own. I wonder if this is true. But if a child is transgender, they can start taking puberty blockers before the age of puberty, which makes a gender transition surgery much easier. Still, 8 to 10 seems very early for a child to know to express their sexuality to their parents. I would agree. I think that parents have to be on the lookout for how they think their child is going to express their gender and whether or not their children are going to be attracted to same-sex or opposite sex. And they have to be responsible to making these tough decisions with their children as they go along, as opposed to ignoring it or, worse yet, shaming it. So that is really on the parents. Children are children until they're 18 years old, and it's our responsibility to give them information and help them make these decisions along the way. So someone says the peripheral vision and threat detection information was helpful and that the SAT information was as well. Someone says, I'm wondering about the childbirth experience for women. With so much innervation of the birth canal, how does the birth experience impact the sexual response system of the woman giving birth? That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that, but I know that the more women are numbed, the less experience they have of naturally pushing the baby forward, and the body has less of an opportunity to do what it's designed to do. And also the infant has less of a connection to the mother. The infant is pushing against a mother who's essentially not able to feel much of the infant's body. So the infant's traction against the mother's body, against the vaginal canal, needs to be a symbiotic and co-regulatory experience. In other words, the infant and the mother, or the infant's having the experience of, wow, we're in this together, she's in this with me. And this, again, is a conscious conversation that couples need to have with each other, and that people need to mull over for themselves based on their age, what their capacities are, and what they want and need from their birthing situation, so it's not blind obedience where doctors are concerned. Some says I'm in a relationship with someone that makes me so angry so often, but I like the sex with that person, so I find myself pushing aside my anger to have the sex, but I feel shut down even though sex feels good. And I would say that that is not a healthy relationship for you over time, that you are getting and I'm going to use the word addicted because the word addiction simply means a strong predilection for something. So you can be addicted to chocolate, high heel shoes, your iPhone, exercising, or a guy that you like having sex with, even though he makes you angry and you push aside your anger to have sex with him. You are violating yourself when you do that. If you're pushing aside your anger, you're violating your body so that you can get off, and you are discharging that anger through sex. So it's a form of eroticized rage or sexual hostility, and you don't want to get into a pattern of doing that with men because that's going to leave you beached in many different ways, emotionally, psychologically, and it's going to hurt over time. So be very careful about that. Stop hurting yourself. There are plenty of guys that are hot sexually that you are going to love having sex with that don't piss you off before, during, and after. So moving on here, partners are the obvious helpers in exploring sexuality and healing sexual wounds. And I say that because the people that can help you heal your sexuality faster than anyone is a sexual partner that you love and trust, not a therapist, not a sex coach, not a sex educator, but actually getting into the sexual arena, which goes back to John's question about being a recovering sex addict. You have to have sex again. You have to have sex that is life-affirming and feels good for you, and the only way to do that is to have sex. So, John, you should have a dating plan and a healthy sex plan for yourself, and you should be accountable to a therapist or a sponsor or somebody that you trust that can help you walk through that process. And you're going to do it imperfectly, and it's going to be messy because sex is messy. So ask yourself, who can you trust to explore as yet unknown aspects of your sexuality? So with whom can you do that with? And take a leap and do that. Think about your new year. Think about the intentions that you want to set for your sex and sexuality. And think about the kind of sexual person that you want to be going forward. How do you want to mature in 2015 sexually? Where do you want to take yourself on? What are your sexual limitations? What haven't you tried that you want to try? What are you doing too much of that is hurting you, like this young woman who writes about having angry sex with someone? Where do you want to look at that and say, you know what, I deserve more than that. That was kind of fun for a while. It was sort of hot, but I don't think I want to make a steady diet of that. It would be like, imagine, living your life during the holidays where you're eating every single piece of pie and pastry and chocolate and freaky caramelized popcorn that comes past you. Do you want to live like that for the year and then just feel ill and, 20 or 30 pounds overweight? Or do you want to say, that was fun over the holidays and I tried it all and I had a really good time, but enough is enough. So think about your sexuality in that way. Think of it as a sacred place inside of you that's your divine right, and that you get to define according to what has meaning to you, what feels good to you, and what's true for you or you and a partner. And don't let it be any other way. Don't compromise. All right, here's wishing you a happy new year, a happy new you, a happy new sexuality, and I look forward to seeing all of you in February. Take care.